Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about comparative anatomy. So we're going to be looking at the circulatory, nervous, and respiratory systems of the various animals that we've been talking about in the animal kingdom. So for this lecture, you're going to need to pull out your chart to fill out for those comparisons. So let's start with the circulatory system and what that does. You're familiar with it in your own body. That's the blood circulating through your entire body, and it transports nutrients, waste, oxygen, and carbon dioxide to and from the cells. And there are three methods of this transport that is used in invertebrates. So remember, we broke down our animals into vertebrates and invertebrates. So starting with our invertebrates, let's look at the circulatory system of the invertebrates, and there are three methods. First is diffusion, or technically no circulatory system, and that usually means that these are aquatic organisms and their cells either come directly in contact with water that allows for all those exchanges to take place, or they are close to another cell that's then close to water, so usually very thin invertebrates. And then the second is an open circulatory system. You guys did some research on this, so we'll go a little bit into detail with that. And the third is a closed circulatory system, which is what you have, where blood is contained within blood vessels. Okay, so let's talk about diffusion. This means each cell is exposed to water, or at least is close to it, and then each cell can independently exchange those gases and eliminate waste directly with the water. And we see those in the sponges. Remember, we said they were probably only like 2 to 3 layers thick. We also see it in the cnidarians and the flatworm. And remember, in the flatworms in particular, the diffusion is with the gastrovascular cavity. So if you are looking at our planaria, like we've mentioned before, and all this dark stain is the gastrovascular cavity, that comes in direct contact with the water, and therefore all those exchanges can take place there. And then our echinoderms have the water vascular system that we talked about. So particularly the tube feet is where a lot of that gas exchange occurs, and then the water flows all through those canals. So all that exchange occurs via diffusion in the water vascular system. So in general, there are two types of circulatory fluids. There's blood that you're most familiar with, and that's contained within blood vessels, and that's in a closed circulatory system. And then there's hemolymph, and hemolymph has more of a greenish color to it, and that is a circulatory fluid that dumps into a cavity called the hemocoel, and those organs are contained within that hemocoel so that the hemolymph bathes the organs, and that those gas exchanges and waste exchanges can take place that way. So here's an open circulatory system and a closed circulatory system. So for example, when we are looking at insects, such as the grasshopper, we've mentioned before that they have an open circulatory system. That means that they use hemolymph as their circulatory fluid, and the cavity which it dumps into is called the hemocoel. So here is the heart, and this whole cavity would be the hemocoel. So the heart is then bathed in hemolymph. Now that's different from a closed circulatory system. In this case, we're looking at that in terms of our earthworm in phylum Annelida, our segmented worms. In this case, they use blood, and it's all contained within these vessels. So the vessels then are on the exterior of the heart, also sometimes in the interior, and the exchange occurs across the blood vessels. There's some examples of that right here. There's the dorsal blood vessel and the ventral blood vessel, and then they have lateral vessels that run crosswise. And remember, in our earthworm we had 5 hearts, and that helps to pump the blood throughout the vessels. So just kind of as a reiteration, our open circulatory system, they still have what's called a heart, and it pumps the hemolymph via vessels into the open tissue spaces. So, but it's not, it doesn't have those capillaries that contain the fluid. This one, it's transported via vessels, but then dumps into a cavity. So our animals with our open circulatory system are our bivalves, like our clams, our gastropods, and all of our arthropods. The closed circulatory system, the heart pumps blood to the capillaries, and then the vessels return the blood to the heart without contact between the blood and the tissues specifically. It's the contact between the capillaries and the tissues, and then the exchange occurs across there. So our animals with a closed circulatory system are our annelids, like this, our earthworm, our cephalopods, and our vertebrates. Okay, so that was the circulatory system of invertebrates. Now we're going to cover the circulatory system of our vertebrates. Okay, so in vertebrates, they all have a closed circulatory system. And the vertebrate heart has chambers. So that's different from, if you'll remember, like the earthworm closed circulatory system had 5 small hearts. That's completely different in our vertebrates. The vertebrate has chambers within the heart. The atria that receives the blood back from the body, and the ventricles that pump the blood out to the rest of the body. So when we look at the different groups of our vertebrates and looking at the chambers of their heart, let's start with the fish. Our fish have a 2-chambered heart, so 1 atria, 1 ventricle, and within that heart, the ventricle pumps that blood out to the gills where it gets oxygenated, and then it comes back into the atria. Very simple system. The 3-chambered heart of the amphibian is a little bit different because that means that there's a mixing of the oxygenated blood and the deoxygenated blood. So 2 atria, 1 ventricle. So the blood gets pumped out the ventricle to the lungs and also to the skin. Remember, they have cutaneous respiration. And then that oxygenated blood comes back into this atria right here, and then mixes, and then goes again from the same ventricle out to the rest of the body and back in to this atrium here. So there is a mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. When we move on to our reptiles, they have a 3-chambered heart that has a septum in the middle of its atria. Ventricle. Sorry. A septum in the middle of its ventricle. Otherwise, it's the same process as the amphibians, but slightly less mixing of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Then we go to birds and mammals, and there's a 4-chambered heart. So 2 ventricles and 2 atriums. So 2 atria. So we have deoxygenated blood flowing out of this ventricle here into the lungs, and then the oxygenated blood coming back into the atria, and then from this ventricle out to the rest of the body, deoxygenated back into that atria right there. So there's no mixing of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. So that's what our vascular system or cardiovascular system looks like in our vertebrates. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the nervous system. The nervous system is what allows an animal to sense what's going on around it and what's going on inside of its own body. So it can seek food, it can avoid danger, And then it can monitor its internal and external environment, so also allowing it to maintain homeostasis. So if you remember way back when, in one of the first lectures when we started talking about life, and we said in order to be a living organism, you had to be able to maintain homeostasis. Ooh, that was a long time ago. But here it is. The nervous system helps animals maintain homeostasis. Okay, so first of all, phylum Porifera has no nervous system. And then we move on to our Cnidaria, our flatworms, which are the platyhelminthes, and then our Annelida. So our Cnidarians have a very simple nervous system called a nerve net, and impulses travel in many directions at once, but it's a very simplified system. If you remember, our flatworms have the ladder-like nervous system with some cerebral ganglia, which are mostly just a bundle of nerves up near the auricles. And then our annelids, as well as our arthropods, have a larger number of neurons, and they have a ventral nerve cord and a real brain. So left to right, we're starting to get more complex nervous systems, going from Cnidaria to flatworm to annelids. Okay, continuing with our annelids and arthropods, like we said, we have an increased number of neurons and a real brain. So those crabs do have a real brain. They also have what's called a thoracic ganglia at the other end of their body. And then our cephalopods, remember the term cephalopod meant head, foot? They have a definite brain with giant nerve fibers, and if you'll remember when we talked about the octopus, they could learn behaviors by watching another animal. So we're definitely getting a more complex nervous system. And then our vertebrates have the largest brain, and then they have a spinal cord, of course, with nerves going out from there. But just as a side note, a larger brain doesn't always mean higher intelligence. There's some correlation to it, but there's also been a lot of studies that show that the amount of infolding, or the surface area on a brain, is what corresponds to higher level thinking. So that's just a little bit of information to think about. I'm not going to expect you to know all of this. I just wanted you to take a moment. Really, for me, it's a matter of going, wow, that is amazing. Like how our nervous system works with the spinal cord. It's just so intricate, and has it, well, I guess that's it. Very, very intricate. So each section of our spinal cord has the dorsal horn, and then has what's called the peripheral nerve, and that's usually where information is coming into the spinal cord. So there's a receptor, the information comes in on the dorsal side, and then there's an exchange that takes place that takes that information and then sends out new information in the form of information to a motor neuron, for instance, to then respond to the information that it's been given. And so that happens out the ventral side. And of course, each vertebrate along the way has these lovely nerves associated with that area, and they all reach different regions of our body. And of course, this happens in a matter of very split seconds, literally. So it really is very complex and quite an amazing structure. Okay, in mammals, there is a section of the forebrain called the neocortex, and that is the space in our brain that's responsible for spatial reasoning and conscious thought and language. And that is only found in mammals. Okay, moving on to the respiratory system. How does gas exchange take place? So the respiratory system enables gas exchanges to occur between the body's cells and the environment. So gas exchange has to take place on a wet surface. And I think we mentioned that before because that's why amphibians have to stay moist, because their skin is used for respiration. So the reason that we even need gas exchange to begin with is because of cellular respiration. So oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. So the respiration system itself is what enables the gas exchange between the body's cells and the environment itself. So if we look over here on this image, we're talking about internal respiration right here at the tissue level, or cell and tissue level. So as we said before, oxygen in, carbon dioxide out. So once that carbon dioxide is out, it goes, for instance, for us, out through the lungs, and there can be an exchange with oxygen coming in, and then through the whole respiratory system, oxygen is brought to the individual cells that then need it. So starting with our phylum Porifera, how do you think they do gas exchange? Well, pretty much just like you would expect, and just like we talked about before, they don't have a specific respiratory system because they do it through diffusion, right? Water comes in and it bathes all these cells, so gas exchange can occur directly across. So diffusion is their means of respiration. For Cnidaria, the gas exchange again is the same thing. It's diffusion because we have water flow coming in and out, and it's only a few cell layers thick, so there's direct exchange with that water. So once again, diffusion is the means of respiration. Okay, this isn't going to surprise you anymore. The platyhelminthes and the nematoda, again, through diffusion, directly across their skin. That's why, again, these animals must stay in a moist environment because water is required for that gas exchange to occur. Okay, what about phylum Mollusca? We've talked about this before, right? So here in bivalvia, you know that they have gills because we've already talked about that. And then our gastropods right here, they have lungs because remember they're land snails, so they have lungs. And then our cephalopods, the cephalopods are our squid and our octopus. So when you did that squid dissection, you would have noticed that they have gills as well. All right, phylum Annelida. So we have talked about how they have this lovely vascular system, right, where they can deliver nutrients and waste and gas exchange across those particular membranes, but it is still through diffusion through the skin is where all of that is taking place. So diffusion directly across their thin skin. And in Annelida, remember if you saw the sandworms, so there are some aquatic versions, and those aquatic versions again have diffusion across their skin. Some may have extra little feathery areas that look a little bit like gills as well. Okay, let's look at our phylum Arthropoda. For those that are terrestrial like our insects, particularly looking at the grasshopper as an example, they have what's called trachea. So here's the trachea here. It runs the length of the body, and components of it are this spiracle that is a hole reaching towards the exterior of the organism, and the back side of it is a big air sac. And so that's where gas exchange takes place for our insects. Now, our crustaceans, for instance, like when we did the dissection of the crayfish, remember they had gills that were attached to their walking legs. And then our spiders have what we call book lungs. And so that's these right here, actually. Sorry, it's in a different language, but those are the book lungs. So in our phylum Arthropoda, we have everything from the trachea to gills to book lungs. So all three of those are found in phylum Arthropoda. What about phylum Echinodermata? This is our sea star, our sea urchins, sand dollars, sea cucumbers, all of them. They all do this through mainly through diffusion. So if you think about our sea star had those tube feet, and they have the whole water vascular system where gas exchange can occur through diffusion. And then they additionally actually have gills or gill slits on the top of their body. So here we go. This is a better image of that, or at least a diagram that helps. So the tube feet themselves allow for gas exchange to occur, and then all through the canals the water runs, so diffusion through all these parts. But then on the aboral side there are gills, so it's accomplished by both methods. Okay, what about our ray-finned fish? This is the easy one, right? They have gills. Gills is how it happens in the water. So what's interesting is looking at these gills at like kind of under a microscope. Each one has these lamella, and the way this works is the water flows across them in this direction, and the blood flow, or deoxygenated blood, flows in this direction. And as they cross each other, there's an exchange of oxygen. So that's shown really well in this diagram right here. So as the water comes across, it has a lot of oxygen, and then as it flows across the lamella, it releases oxygen, and so the blood flow across these lamella start out really low but increase in oxygen concentration. So they flow in the opposite direction. That's how those gills work. Okay, what about our amphibians? Well, amphibians actually have three different forms of respiration because they go through metamorphosis. So at the very beginning, when they're in tadpole form, they have gills. As they begin to metamorphosize into what we know of as proper frogs, they have cutaneous respiration across their skin. That's where most of their gas exchange takes place. And then they also have small lungs. So gills, cutaneous respiration, and lungs are all part of the respiratory system of amphibians. What about reptiles? Well, when we start talking about reptiles, this is when we have a proper lung. Large lungs, they're supported by rib cages to protect them, and so that is where reptiles have their gas exchange. So respiratory organs of reptiles are lungs. And then we get into our birds. And we went into detail about this when we talked about birds, so I'm just going to kind of review it real quickly. So this slide should look familiar. So birds do have lungs. They also have about 7 to 9 air sacs in addition to their lungs. And some of those air sacs even extend into the bones. But unlike our lungs, birds do not have diaphragms to push them out, to cause them to contract or open them up. Instead, they use pressure changes in the air sacs to push the air across the lungs. So the lungs is still where the gas exchange occurs, but the amount of air being put across them is powered basically by all of these air sacs. So as the muscles in the chest push the sternum out, that causes negative pressure, allowing air to enter into the lungs, or inhalation. And then muscles contract around the air sacs to then contract the air sacs, and that positive pressure causes exhalation. And it's actually on the exhalation that the gas exchange is most efficient, and that's where that occurs. So bird lungs are actually more efficient than human lungs, so for whatever that's worth. And then what about mammals? I'm pretty sure you know that before I even tell you the answer to that one. Right, very complex lungs with lots and lots of capillaries, and then the lungs are compartmentalized all the way from the bronchi all the way down to the alveoli. And there's a capillary network that's around each of these alveoli to allow for efficient gas exchange to occur. I think those of you who have had human anatomy and physiology or are preparing to go to PA school might know about this a little bit more than I do, but it is a very complex system. That's it for the animal kingdom. So long, animal kingdom. See you later.